All right, welcome to another episode of New Wine Uncorked. And as always, we're coming to you live, on YouTube, and we're stoked to be here. I'm stoked to be here with Phil and Tony, as always, and we're continuing our conversation about the church and who we are. And last week we were talking about, I wrote down this, the church, stepping out of the box. We were talking about suffering and authenticity. And then this week, we want to get into, and Tony brought it up actually last week about the topic that we're going to be talking about is the competing narratives, but not just narratives. We are specifically talking, and Tony, you mentioned this last week about competing Christianities. And then something interesting happened. Throughout this week, especially with the things going on politically with Georgia. But then an instance happened with you, Tony, that made me really think about this. And you were just doing it to highlight. I mean, there was nothing ill-willed, I felt like, in your bones. And for those of you that don't know, for those of you that don't follow Tony on Instagram, let me just tell you, it is a trip. I think it was yesterday or the day before, he was out and he was getting his mom to it. It's fun. Okay. It's better than if you guys take time to watch, Ozzy Osbourne, his thing with his son, or the Kardashians. Put it all aside. You follow this guy on Instagram, So, but prior to that, though, Tony shared a situation that he experienced at the DMV. And it made me think, okay, there are competing actual realities in some sense. That sounds weird, but how people trip out about, like, could there be other planets and other worlds? Gosh, as Christians, are we in tune enough, aware enough to see that there are actual competing Christianities, and it plays out in things that we might think is insignificant? And what I'm talking about is at the DMV, Tony, you experienced something, clearly was based on race. I don't know how else you can describe it. And I was just wondering, share a little bit about, like, what was going on, and what do you think when that, because for me, I've never had something like that happen. And so I don't know how you seem super gracious. And how is it that when we have these competing realities, how do we embrace them authentically, but in love, and yet still with conviction to change that which is wrong?
Totally. And so I would describe it as like very low grade as far as how offensive it was. But I mean, it gave me and you and other people in my life a huge laugh. But so my license had expired and I had to go to the DMV to renew my license. And so I fill out my form and everything's okay. And I go to get my picture taken. So the lady behind the camera, she asked me to take off my mask and my glasses. I do so, and she's like, okay, smile. And in stereotypical, Asian fashion, I smile and my eyes get much smaller than they already are. And then she goes, oh, we're going to have to take that photo again because the machine can't detect your eyes. Could you open your eyes wider? And I know this rodeo because I take a Costco photo like every 2 years. So I don't smile and my eyes, fit the thing. And she goes, but you don't have to look so serious. Like, you can smile. This isn't a serious thing. So I do this awkward smile, trying to maintain my eye width and not looking like I'm committing a crime. And she's like, no, just be natural. And we go in this dance, but then like the line is getting longer and like the temperature's rising for the people watching this. I can see she's like realizing like how awkward this is, and I'm sweating because like performance anxiety. It's like there's nothing I can do. Like, you want me to smile, but my eyes keep closing. And so finally she calls her supervisor over and like very quietly, but the room's like dead quiet. She's trying to communicate to him that like, hey, the machine can't detect his eyes, but like, I don't want to make this a race thing. Like, he's smiling, but I can't see his eyes. Like, what do we do? And then finally her supervisor looks at me and he's just like, hey, we'll go with your best looking photo. It's not a big deal. If anybody gives you trouble, like, just send them our way, as if like that's going to do anything. And I could feel like he's trying to de-escalate the situation, but it wasn't. My sheer presence and my sheer experiencing that type of thing was already raising the tension. And so I could see the lady was very uncomfortable and just like almost like pleading with me, like, hey, please don't make this a thing. And it wasn't a thing for me, but I think this is where I need Jesus. And I'm thankful it's Holy Week, because I just said to them, hey, I know you guys aren't racist. It's the machine. And so afterwards, I posted that to Instagram, and all of my Asian friends, well, a majority of my Asian friends reached out to me, and they're like, it's so true. Like, um, it, the United States seem to be weird because we're the only country that encourages smiling in any of our like official documents. And for Asian people, that's difficult, because if you want our eyes a certain size for identification and you're encouraging us to smile, it's a lose-lose. And so it's a very low grade uh instance, but it's just so funny. I mean, I took no offense to her and to the supervisor at the DMV. I just thought it was funny, the event, um and what took place. But yeah, so contending realities. Even at the DMV, people experience something so trivial, but also necessary as far as like government documentation. Um, there are so many different experiences at the DMV. I mean, now we're required to have quote unquote real IDs. And so in order to get a real ID, you need your birth certificate and your social security number. This adversely affects our undocumented brothers and sisters. Like, we have competing realities in which we all engage and have our moving in our being. So
Yeah, I was wondering, do you think you're talking about the competing realities, and it comes into competing Christianities, and that's what we were talking about a little bit last week. But while you say that, it wasn't tremendous offense, it still was an offense. I'm wondering though, if little things like this are what then, when left because they are kind of small and you are exceptionally gracious, but it still is a form of direct racism, because if the machine is set up that way, there's, it goes back to someone had to set up the parameters in which the camera understood what an open eye, an acceptable open eye, right? So it's based on some standard eye that is saying to you, your eye doesn't meet our standard, whoever our is, and so got me thinking though, okay, this isn't, and it's so weird because what we compare it, so this isn't George Floyd, so is that the standard, but then still racism is racism, right? Just as sin is sin. And so if we don't speak, like, so I was thinking about it, I don't know, it just got me thinking, because this is stuff that, like, I've never been confronted with this. You were confronted with this not because of anything other than who you are and based on someone else's standards as to what, so do little things like this, though, lead to Georgia and the voting rights? Do they then eventually lead to last summer, if we, meaning the Christian church, doesn't have then one understanding, one vision? Because like you were saying last week, Tony, like with the guys like Ravi Zacharias and with Mark Driscoll, they were promoting, and they tended to be MacArthur, very apologetic driven, which then is a competition of who is right and who is wrong, And so what if though folks like me, you and Phil are like, hey, this wasn't, I mean, in the big picture, the offensiveness here, because you are way tight with Jesus. I mean, because I'm curious, because of Holy Week, we talk about Emmanuel during Christmas, God with us. Not very many people talk about us with God on the cross. We talk about putting our sins at the foot of the cross, but how many of us actually talk about crawling up and being hung and scrutinized and tortured with Christ, right? Well, if I am willing to do that, would I be willing to send, even just like I was thinking, if I live in Portland, do I send a letter to the DMV? Do I send a letter to my congressperson, say this is unacceptable about the picture taking even? I'm just wondering, when you were telling me about this and sharing with us the Instagram, and you were super gracious, what is it though that we need to do something, we meaning the church, with situations like this? Because this is just when people say, oh, it's getting better, this clearly is showing it's not getting better.
I think tangential to what you just asked is this. Um, because of the attacks in Georgia and the attacks in San Francisco and the most recent attack in New York on an Asian elderly lady who was walking to church, the phrase "Stop AAPI Hate" has been uh, uh, shared throughout social media. But what we don't see is the reaction against that that says "Stop all hate." So when we say Black Lives Matter, we get a counter movement that says all lives matter and blue lives matter. And so I think what we see is for the Black community, the system treats them as threats. And so the system, our governmental, legal systems and structures treat the Black community, treat Black bodies as expendable and threats. So the system inflicts violence upon Black bodies. As far as Asian bodies, um, there is not that reaction of stop all hate, because I think to the system, the Asian body is just an inconvenience and not a threat. um what we see, and so when we talk about the DNV, like that's an inconvenience. My body is an inconvenience to the system in regards to identification, and therefore it can be spun as an inconvenience to me and all of my privileges. In a way, it is just an inconvenience. um but because change for the Asian community does not necessarily affect the system and the structures, there's no counter reaction. But change to the system so that Black bodies are no longer harmed means a fundamental change of privilege and equity and equality. Therefore, there's a counter reaction as expressed by all lives matter and blue lives matter. And so I say that because, yes, this is not a um, competition for oppression and suffering. But I think this is to talk about intersectionality and particularity of how we each have our moving and our being, and how we relate to one another and therefore relate to our government and our legal systems. I think from a Christian conviction, Dr. Willie Jennings from Yale has this fantastic sermon where he talks about Judas could only betray Jesus if Judas was a disciple. And I think that's my posture. And to your point, Matt, when you talk about us with Jesus on the cross, I don't even feel holy enough to be with Jesus on the cross. I very much identify myself with Judas. I'll give Jesus the kiss because I don't want to suffer. I'll publicly declare who the Savior is because it might afford me some sort of social equity. And I think that's what's insidious about sin and privilege is we all say we wouldn't be Jesus or Judas, but Judas could only betray Jesus if he was a disciple. And so uh, this is all to say, yeah, how do we have our moving and our being? What constitutes our human moving and being? And how does that relate to our church structures and to our legal structures?
Yeah, it's interesting too with the start of April and coming into this next, wherever the church is at, especially in the movement of COVID-19 and things, with people trying to open up, then there's outbreaks. And it's with this Easter this year, I'm wondering too, with how many people are within the church focusing on this, looking back at this last year and seeking to understand what happened, where we at, and then does our narrative, the resurrection narrative, the ascension narrative that we have this week and this weekend, does it unify us with other churches around, or again, do we have a fight to the finish of whose apologetics, whose truth is more viable, and it's interesting we see, because what Christian voice then do we see throughout this weekend? Remember last year, all we did was rip on former President Trump on his hope. Maybe it was a hope where he said that the vaccine would be gone by Easter, right? Well, what are we doing this year? Like, no one's even saying it, where the church is at, as far as it just seems like the church continues to compete. And when we compete with each other, we get exactly what you were saying, where it's almost like the races then compete with each other, says, no, we're more oppressed. And instead of looking at, okay, well, what is the oppression? It's obviously but why? Why does it continue to happen, even at small levels like that, Tony? I think just even a basic understanding for people who don't look like you, who have never experienced that, just to understand, gosh, these things happen at little things, because I have so many friends who go, but it's getting better, right? Better according to what? According to who? Is this Easter, is there a feeling of resurrection and ascension for all Christians across the nation? Or are there groups of Christians feeling more oppressed and still beaten down because of the color of their skin, the size, the dimension of their eyes, the fact that when they go out on the street, they're not safe? Like, what is the church though doing? Like, what can we do to, like, it's one thing to say, hey, Resurrection Sunday, we're all good with Jesus, but then Monday go out and our brains haven't changed and we still see the other as a threat, like you're saying, or see the other as insignificant. To me, it's like just as is damaging or damning if we see one group of people, or the church recognizes one as a threat and the other as insignificant. That, how is it that the church's message though is not coming through, that this weekend it matters? What Jesus did broke through. Like, it really does matter when he says there are no Jews or Gentile, no male or female, free or, like, how does this message this weekend permeate to where then we don't have competing Christianities, but we have what you said, communal contribution, Tony? What's the road forward for the church post Easter? Is Easter 2021 going to be different? It feels, could it be? And how? And why? Like, why would the church buy into it now? Over the last year, it doesn't seem like the church has been buying into reconciliation. Isn't Easter all about reconciliation?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts I want to offer here. I think in our rush to talk about Easter, we kind of overlook Good Friday, Monday, Thursday, entirety of Holy Week, and just the night side, the dark side that presents. A couple of years ago, when I was working in youth ministry, we did Saturday night services, and so we had an Easter Saturday night service. And I'm putting together my curriculum for my middle school students, and I couldn't say he is risen. It was Saturday because I want to. What is it like? I mean, I'm talking to middle school kids, so I put together a curriculum on Superman is dead. God is dead. What do you feel now? What do you think the disciples feel? And just stay in that moment for a little bit, because we want to rush to the winter. We want to rush to the day when he is risen and everything is bright and everything is good. But Friday night was the worst the disciples could imagine. So much so, up to the week, right? They all left him. Judas betrayed him initially, but they all left him in the end. And so just sitting in that moment, and I think because we're afraid to live in that moment, to live in the night side. Okay, so take Tony's example from earlier. Change the machine. We upgrade the machine and it accepts everyone's eye dimensions in some regard or another. Grandma could still get kicked in the stomach walking to church the very next day. Like, what's the difference between a gesture and real change? And I think that's what you're pointing towards. But because the essence of we don't know how to live in America without racism. We don't know how to live in America where privilege is not taken advantage, where power is not intoxicating. So we find ourselves consistently, hopefully, coming to a point where we look at the night side, where we look at the dark side and say, okay, wait, these are our evils. These are the things that we've lived with. So now let's change in light of this, in light of what we're seeing, not at our best, but when we're at our worst, and look at that change from that point. But I think we want to get to Easter before we look at Good Friday.
Yeah, that's a great point, dude. I totally We do. We totally want the winner. And you're seeing this play out. We so go inward. I mean, gosh, this stuff that's going on with this representative from Florida now with the sex trafficking and the underage, like, you're right. There are the power. I mean, a while back, Tony, you were talking about like the intoxication of power and how we see this. And there's such an arrogance with folks in power that they believe that whatever they do is right. And this is my son and I were talking about this and who knows when it happened. Was it in the Enlightenment, or is it the move, from the medieval into the Enlightenment? And the change from when the church had authority. And so the idea of goodness was always resting in who God is. But now goodness rests in the group who has power, the majority power. And over the years, as you were saying, Phil, I mean, if what your statement that you just said, that we've never lived in our society, our nation without racial tension, without racism, if that doesn't just sting us in the heart, I'm like, and you're not saying anything that's untrue, and you're not being like aggressive and you're saying, dude, here's our reality. So what do we do with it? Right. Because we don't want gestures. We want real action. And so when my son and I were talking about just the legitimacy of the truth of our actions, how do we know, what is it that solidifies what Christians call word deed? You don't just love in word, but in deed also. What solidifies when the church is talking about, hey, you're important? Because I was talking about someone in the Chauvin case right now, right? Both sides of the spec, people trying to come up with reasons why it was okay what he did, and then reasons why, like, oh, it was not okay because the knee was not necessary. Both in we see the situation in front of us. Clearly, what was happening was not okay. And yet we have these competing narratives as trying to determine what was right or what's wrong. And yet, I don't care. Like, is the church so absent that we can't just say that's wrong, that's right, and people go, yes, you're right? Now we even, wrestle and argue about, well, yeah, but that could be right. A guy putting a knee on another guy just is never, in so many situations is never right. We know the situations where it could be a gun, he's beating a baby, like all those things. Clearly what we saw was not right. And yet we're wrestling, we're arguing, is it right? I just wonder, is that so much indicative? Christians should look at this and go, this is absolutely a shit show, totally. But it's more of an indication as to where I am at with Jesus, because my community is not rising up and going, dudes, this is not a question of right or wrong. It clearly is wrong. I mean, have we so fallen wherever we've fallen to where even the question of right or wrong is up for debate, that we just don't even know what good is anymore?
Yeah, I don't think that's a new argument per se. I think that we've consistently lived in an America where the powerful can walk their way out of something and the poor will walk smack dab into it. This is the reality of the country that we've lived in. And I mean, I think back to Trayvon Martin, when we were talking, and I remember watching that trial thinking, how many times is there a courtroom where there's a murder that's happened? Everyone knows who the murderer is. Everyone knows who was murdered, but then the person that was the murderer walks away not guilty. And not guilty doesn't even mean innocent in this case. It just means he's not getting these particular charges. And it's like, same kind of thing here. Anyone who looks at that is like, there's something wrong about this picture. But was he wrong in doing what he did? What are we talking about here? What are we even talking about? And okay, say he is wrong. Well, he was following his rules. He was following what should have happened. Well, those rules are wrong. And those rules need to change. Something needs to change in light of this. But instead, we can go and say, hey, well, he was proven innocent. Move on to the next thing. No, 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 no. This is what we're talking about, gestures versus change. Because we have that moment where we see this and we're like, wait, okay, he's innocent. Well, then what was wrong here? Something was wrong here. And we have to consistently look into the dark side of it. How can we produce rules that makes it so what happened to George Floyd is okay? What happened to Trayvon Martin is okay? There's no way, there's no reality where that is okay. So we need to figure out, well, what do we need to change? Because something needs to change. And we got to consistently have that voice to it, that something needs to change about these situations. So people like this, so we can't have this kind of stuff happen in this country. That's it. I could say a whole bunch more.
No, and to your point, Phil, I think what we see in the history of our nation is that there has been the Black church and the white church. There has been the church that has opposed slavery, and there's been the church that's benefited from slavery. And then there's some white churches that have benefited less in their word and deed. They have actively tried to oppose slavery, but in some ways they've just benefited less from slavery. And I think continually for younger people, those of us who are just living through this now, we feel like the church has finally started talking about it. But in reality, it's not that the church has finally started talking about it, it's that we're just experiencing it for the first time. And in humility, we need to understand that this is an ongoing defining moment of this country and of the church in this country. This isn't something new. And we have this amnesia where we think it's new. And so we have no substantive solutions. And so to your point, Phil, it's all only gestures and it's not genuine change. And I think for white churches that no longer want to benefit from slavery, but they haven't worked through the theology that they've inherited due to white supremacy, what happens is they think, okay, if Black people are dying due to violence, and there's a disproportionate amount of Black people dying, maybe if we stop seeing them as Black, the problem goes away. But in reality, the law still see Black people as Black. And therefore, the issue is only compounded when white churches choose colorblindness as an alternative to actually seeing Black people for Black people, and how the law adversely affects and targets the Black community. And only then will the Hispanic community and the Asian American community begin to also experience true justice and liberative change, is when we all understand and move towards genuine transformation and change for the Black community, because it's all connected. And so the church can no longer choose. And I think in every generation, there's a defining moment, and this is our defining moment. And the church, I don't believe the church, quote unquote, churches will be united. I think there will be a continuing division, because some churches will still choose to actively participate in white supremacy, and other churches will choose to actively oppose white supremacy. And we can't serve two masters. So this is what it means when the word divides and the Lord comes with a sword and he splits. Now, it might not be our place to say you're not a true Christian, but there is a place to say, man, it's hard for us to maintain fellowship when your theology allows for the murdering of Black people, and you will do theological and legal gymnastics to say that was good. And so I don't know how we maintain fellowship over that.
Don't you think? Oh, sorry. Go on, Phil. Do you got something?
Oh, actually, that last point, I don't know how we maintain fellowship. Part of when you look at just Black people in the country, and I'm trying not to be the representative for all Black people here, but there's a distinct pessimism that exists among Black America, because we've lived in this reality. Look, when I came to Christ, found my identity in Christ in the scriptures, I didn't get joined to a white church or a Black church. I got joined to the Church of Jesus Christ. White people didn't give me my gifts. White people didn't give me my identity. And when I chose to go to the churches I go to get the education I got, it wasn't because white people allowed me to do so. I went because I was exploring and trying to understand my identity in Jesus Christ, my gifting in Jesus Christ. All right. So I start there. And then I think that the more and more we end up with the challenge of it's difficult for us to have fellowship because of the things you just mentioned, Tony. When we come to the point where it's difficult for us to have fellowship, we're at a reality where the church, as it stands now, is a failure. Bottom line, is an absolute failure. It's not that this group is allowed in, this person's not allowed, what you're doing is unchristian, this all fine, all that kind of stuff. But as the church, as it stands now, we're powerless and we're a failure because we can't even sit in a room with our own brothers. And that's to me is the consequence of all of this. That's to me is the pain of all of this, that we sit in a divided church that cannot, that whose witness of Jesus Christ is hindered because we can't sit in a room together and understand one another's stories, and we're willing to hurt and harm one another, our own brothers and sisters. And that's the place where I'm like, okay, this is where I look at the church. I'm like, that's the ultimate fail, is that we have failed in this regard where we can't sit together. So
don't you think that goes back to what Tony was saying, is that it always comes through this form of competition, right? We're always competing with each other, so much so that we've actually we have denominations, but we have categorizations of the church. Like you were saying, Tony, we have the Black church, we have the white church, we have the Asian church, we have the Mexican church. But Phil, you came to faith just like I did, entrance into the Church of Jesus Christ, right? Same thing with you, Tony, same thing. And so our entrance into something is then, in classes, if you're taking classes with Metzger, he'll talk about the bait and switch. And it's almost like that becomes our salvation. We are saved into what we are taught, the universal church that is inclusive of everyone. But then when they place you, it's almost like if you've ever done the placement test out of high school for like the armed forces, to see where you rank on that, and then they place you. Ooh, you're good enough for this, or you're smart enough for this. That's almost like what they do, I feel like, and we don't even know who they are, right? This is the problem. It's like, who's the one? Because post 9/11, like you're talking now, and this is the talk that we always want to categorize generations. Okay, well, what's the ethos of this age? The ethos of this time period, I would agree with you, Tony, is, but is the ethos of every age since the dawn of America racial reconciliation? Or is it even deeper of a reconciliation between the human and Christ? Because ever since the church has been moved out to where now you have to defend the existence of God, whereas before it wasn't a question. God existed. What you had to do was to defend the reason for God. That's what the Catholic Church did with Descartes. They commissioned him to give a reason for God, the rationale for God. It wasn't to prove his existence. Now in 2021, there is, first and foremost, you have to prove the existence or even the necessity of God. Okay. And so what then does the church do? And so what we do is, I feel like, because we are raised, you, me, all of us, in a very consumeristic model, that the authority is the one who has power, such that we compete with each other. So if I'm a Christian from a white church, you're a Christian from a Black church, and you're a Christian from an Asian church, guess what? We all have to compete, because there can only be one. We're watching, I watch this show called The Mayans, MC. It's but they have kings, the kings of their motorcycle club, and they're in a struggle right now. And the one group is saying, we need one king. Isn't that what Jesus says? I know it's a very vulgar example and analogy, but isn't that what the church has been saying the whole time? The Gospels, we need one king. The problem is with you people, you meaning humans, are like the people in Judges. You want your own kings, then you realize when you get your own kings, they suck ass, and they start to do exactly everything that I told you not to do, right? You start to consume one another, you start to oppress one another, all for what? So that people like you, who look like you, who smell like you, who whatever, get the power. So what then is the church's reaction though? How do we, because you're saying something needs to change, Phil, something does. Do we all know what that something is, where we need to die to self But the truth is, the hardest thing for me to do and to recognize this weekend is that, hey, it's easy. I will praise the death of Jesus, because you know what? Jesus's death is not my death. I'm not, I don't have to die. I'll let Jesus die. I'll ride his coattails of the goodness, as long as I'm in relationship with him, we're good. But death to self, because if we truly, what if surrender really was one of the core aspects of the Christian church today? If we surrendered to Christ, and if we were honest, how much have I surrendered to Christ? Would my perspective, my viewpoint of who you are, Tony, who you are, Phil, who George Floyd is, who Trayvon Martin is, like, would my view change when I hear the jargon of society, the lies of society about the women in Atlanta, that they were less than because of what they did, even the dude who went into the 21-year-old who went into King Soopers, even that guy though needs the same care and compassion that the folks that were killed. Is the church's heart big enough? Is it willing to embrace and have compassion? Or are we so bent on competition that we don't even see that what we're doing is we're competing and we're consuming one another and just destroying the landscape that God sought to create through his outpouring of love?
Dead air. Tony, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I think so. Phil, you and I, we share the same conviction that Jesus is Lord. I think you're just more gracious than I am, which is a sign of Christian maturity. And I'm more firebrand, because I agree with you. The greatest failure of the church is that we can't be united. But I wonder if that isn't the curse that the church sits under because of its refusal to acknowledge that Jesus is Lord. I think within the United States and American Christianity in particular, until we confront our original sin, which is racism and white supremacy, the original sin of this nation, we cannot be faithful. And this isn't to say that God's grace and his salvific work and his sovereignty and providence does not override our sin, but this is also to say we will actively participate in our sin and in our rebellion and our rejection of God, because the church, it goes back to, if the church cannot actively work against the dehumanization of Black people, the church is actively participating in white supremacy. Therefore, when the Hebrew scriptures say, if only my people would repent and turn back to me, then I would hear their prayers. If the church does not work against white supremacy, it has not turned back and repented of its sin, because it'll continue to participate in white supremacy. And it's so, to that point, I am not concerned with saying this church is not authentic Christianity, or this church is authentic Christianity, because I know that Jesus will do that. But judgment is a tremendous gift of mercy and grace, because God can only destroy sin when he has therefore judged that which is sin. And yes, he does that on the cross, but he also does that actively in our lives. And so this isn't, it's a desire for authentic Christianity and Christ-like Christianity that I believe we need to point out when a church or a Christianity, a particular Christianity, is not Christ-like. And so I hear your heart, Phil, about, man, we should not judge lest we be judged, and I'm with you on that. But I also I feel that unless we call it out for what it is, we continue to perpetuate and err on the side of passiveness, and people continue to get away with what they've been getting away with. I think that, Matt, to your point, like the apologetics of, man, it seems like we've tried to prove that God's real. When we look at the theologians of old, even like 100 years ago, nobody was trying to prove that God's real. And I wonder if today that's the flavor of apologetics, because we want to prove that God is real in order to give rationale for our bad behavior and enable our bad behavior. Because if God is real, therefore it means my actions against a particular group of people is justified because God sanctions that behavior. I think we see this within Southern Baptism. Like, God is real, therefore Romans 13 is this literal, non-nuanced, static reading. Therefore, the Confederacy was within their boundaries for seceding from the Union because they wanted slavery. Like, the line is there. And so I think as followers of Jesus, God does not need our defending of his existence. I think his existence is shown most clearly by the way we lay down our lives for one another, not by how we build monuments to his existence. So that's the tension point I sit in.
Well, hold on, let me I don't come at this with a judge not lest you be judged kind of situation. My situation is this. It's the responsibility of us as believers to recognize the body of Christ. If you can't do that, then that says more about you. And then now I need to respond to how you act. So let me break this down a little differently. So America, we had years long said, okay, Americans founded as a Christian nation. The more and more we talk about, we realize that America's founded as a white supremacist nation. This is the foundation of what we went at. So we can say in full regard, we've never had a full Christian church in this country, an authentic Christian church in this country. And that's the hope that I have, being a Christian, that we'll have an authentic Christian church. How, in fact, do we get there becomes the issue. So now, if I choose to use the same weapons of the oppressor to bring about the same thing, where I'm looking and saying, well, if you don't sound like me or talk like me, then you're not doing authentic Christianity, then all right, we're using the same kind of weapons. And so that's the one of the things that I want to avoid in the end. I want to make sure that our methods going to this is righteous. And it's good we're talking about this on Good Friday, because continually looking at that night side, continually being that perpetual Good Friday experience that Black America consistently lives in, is, I believe, the way that we approach this. This is what I look at when I look at King's nonviolent resistance. And that's, for me, is at the heart of all this, where, yeah, we'll bear that on our bodies until the Lord opens your eyes, or until you open your eyes to what the Lord has been doing. And I want to live in that moment, and then consistently remind us that we are consistently living in the moment where Superman is dead, where God is dead. I want to live in that moment consistently remind us that we're there, in hopes that you'll get tired of hearing it and open your eyes saying, whoa, what have I been doing to the body of Christ this entire time? That's what I'm hoping for. And that's the reality we live in. And that's painful, scary. And yeah, why wouldn't you run from that? Why would you want to live in that? Why would you not? It's very easy to not want to hear that, but I want to bring it up at every single turn. I want to when we talk Good Friday, I want to talk about it all day Friday. I want to talk about it all day Saturday. I want to talk about it Sunday morning before we talk about He is risen. Because I want us to remember we're consistently living in a dark side, and that's the reality of much of America and much of the church.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. And perpetual Good Friday. I mean, that's huge, dude. I think, yeah, bro, that's awesome. We don't need to say anymore. Next week, though, we're going to continue talking about this, because we need to continue to talk about to peel back the layers so that we can get to this authentic Christianity that Phil is so brilliant. Like perpetual Good Friday is that is brilliant. And so this is what we're going to continue to talk about. And we're stoked that you joined us this week, but it continues to talk, the dialogue continues on. And next week, we're not going to just move on. We're going to talk about Easter. We're going to talk about Good Friday, though, again and again, because as Phil was saying, in like last week, we were talking about this truth of suffering. Do we really understand victory if we negate the suffering? Right. And so we'll continue to talk about authenticity and authentic Christian. What does it mean when we say, my God is dead? Like, legitimately recognize that my God died, and we have to ask why, right? Why did he die? Why was he willing to do this? And then what does that mean for me? As always, New Wine Uncorked, we're seeking to uncork the possibilities of God in our lives. And so we're stoked that you joined us for New Wine. Go to the YouTube page right now, go right below this video and hit subscribe. Or at the end of this, you'll see this little blue button come up. Just hit subscribe so you're notified for any of the videos that come up each week. We're posting videos, discussions, and dialogue, because this is what we're trying to get into. We're trying to mine the depth of goodness that God has continued to reveal to us so that we can be the body. Like Phil was saying, we can be the church of Jesus Christ living out today, not just in jest, but actual truth, the act of caring for the other. So until we see you again on the flip side, I'm Matt, that's Phil, and that's Tony. This has been New Wine Uncorked. See you on the flip side.